This is the River Ceiriog, the border between England and Wales. But the reason we're here is because of a Scotsman who forged a link with Ireland. His name was Thomas Telford. He built this aqueduct, but one of his greatest achievements was to build a road which went through the rugged mountains of Snowdonia to Holyhead and eventually to the Irish Ferry.
There is no better bird's-eye view of some of the great achievements of the engineer Thomas Telford than at Chirk on the North Wales border, where the road he built stretches like a ribbon southeast into England and northwest towards the mountains of Wales. Telford was born more than 200 years ago, but the route he constructed is still very much in use today. However, Telford's first claim to fame in Wales came not from building roads, but from constructing aqueducts, bridges which carry canals across valleys. Telford not only built the aqueduct across the River Ceiriog, but also this magnificent one, called Pont Cysylltiad, across the valley of the River Dee. The normal practice of the time would have been to construct a succession of canal locks, but the plans that Telford presented had no locks at all. Instead, he proposed to take the canal straight across the valley on a series of pillars. Work began on the aqueduct in 1795. It took 10 years to build and put Telford in the forefront of his profession. It also brought him to the attention of the government, who commissioned him in 1815 to reconstruct the road between London and Holyhead and make it suitable for horse-drawn vehicles. For Telford had proved at Pont Cysylltiad that he was an engineer capable of overcoming the most difficult terrain. There was little to be done to improve the road between London and Shrewsbury. But to build a road fit for stagecoaches through the picturesque but rugged hills of North Wales was a different proposition. It was these hills and the poor roads through them which had prompted the Irish MPs who had to travel through Wales to get to Westminster to put pressure on the government for improvements. The first major town on Telford's road through Wales was Llangollen, dominated by the ancient castle of Dinas Bran. And the fact that Llangollen today is the center of the famous International Eisteddfod is to a great measure due to the road that Telford built. Telford's road out of Llangollen wound on towards Corwen, avoiding the steep slopes of the Berwyn Mountains, since Telford wished to ensure that his gradients were no steeper than 1 in 22, so that the horses pulling a stagecoach could maintain a steady pace of 10 miles an hour. Eventually the road reached the little town of Betws-y-Coed, nestling in the Conwy Valley. At Betws, Telford had no major obstacle to overcome except to bridge the River Conwy, and this he did in style. He planned an elegant single-span cast-iron bridge, and across the arches commemorated the fact it was built in the year of the Battle of Waterloo, and the spandrels are decorated with the national emblems, the leek, the shamrock, the thistle and the rose. I asked a local historian, Ken Miles, about the roads before Telford's time.
The existing roads before Telford's time were ones mainly laid down by the Romans, had been in use, of course, for nearly 2,000 years, and had got into a dreadful state. The main traffic along those roads was by drovers with cattle and other farm animals, even geese, were taken down to London to be sold in the markets in London for money, for the farmers to carry on, of course, with their business when they got back. And with the advent of the stagecoach, the difficulties, of course, were increased. Because firstly, because the roads were not very wide, and secondly, they'd worn badly on the sides, especially on the steep slopes, so there was a tendency for the stagecoach, for the horses and the passengers, to tumble over.
Telford took a lot of care with his roads, and at this workhouse at Minffordd are to be found the grills through which the inmates pushed the stones they broke to match the holes, 2.5 inches in diameter, which was the maximum size Telford would accept for the layer of stones on his road surface. There is a much older bridge at Betws, as Ken Miles explains.
Our Pontypridd is one of the oldest bridges in the area, if not the oldest. A man called Howell the Mason built the bridge, and he lived somewhere around about 1247. I mean, nobody's quite sure about this, except they do know the name, they know that he built it. But the bridge that he built is only half the bridge, or half the width of the bridge, of the present bridge, because in his day, the sort of traffic was horse, no carriages, no stagecoaches. With the advent again of stagecoaches, they had to double the width of the bridge. And this was suggested by Telford himself. Rather than pull down the old bridge, build a new one, which would have cost a lot more money, he suggested that if we double the width by adding another section to the side of it, the downstream side, they would then have enough width for stagecoaches and other vehicles. But the upshot of this was that the bridge had 6 arches on one side and 7 arches on the other, making a total of 13 arches over the river.
Like Llangollen, Betws y Coed was enhanced as a tourist attraction by virtue of Telford's road. But in the days of the stagecoach, only the refined and wealthy could afford to take a holiday.
Now, the main preoccupation of the Victorians, the ladies particularly, was in painting. And the hoteliers opened up, either inside the building itself or perhaps in another outside building, a studio. So the ladies could go in and practice their painting. Now, in addition to this, there was another habit of Victorian ladies, that they did not go out into the sun without a parasol. This meant that they preferred to have a northerly aspect on the hotels. So all the hotels in Betws were built on one side of the road, so they would all face north to satisfy the wants of the Victorian ladies.
And one of the features at Betws y Coed, which attracted the Victorian ladies with their paint boxes, was the Swallow Falls. The falls are on the River Lligwy, just before it joins the Conwy. The name Swallow Falls is a direct translation of the Welsh Rhaeadr y Wynol, but this is a corruption of the original name, which meant the Foaming Falls, Rhaeadr y Wynol. Telford's road went on through Betws y Coed, winding on its gentle gradient through the wooded valley towards the hills, and to meet its greatest challenge, the Snowdonia Range. It was here that Snowdonia's barren mountains, over 3,000 feet high, straddled his path to Holyhead. But still keeping his road on a remarkably even keel, Telford negotiated Lake Ogwen and headed on towards the Nantfrancon Pass.
The Nantfrancon Pass, you see Telford's skill as a road engineer at its best. It's a wild, inhospitable place. Hardly the place to build a road with a gentle gradient. But Telford did it.
The previous road through the pass had followed the contours of the valley uphill and down dale. But by blasting through rocks and supporting his road with a great embankment, Telford kept to his ruling gradient of 1 in 22. A remarkable achievement in one of the most mountainous parts of Britain. Today, motorists speed along the pass in high gear with ease, and little realize the debt they owe to Telford. The road then leaves the mountains behind and heads on towards the next obstacle on its route to Holyhead, the Menai Straits. Maritime historian Aled Eames explains the problems involved.
This sleeve of water, as a 17th century writer described it, has been a barrier to communication between the island of Anglesey and the mainland for centuries, obviously. In fact, the Romans had difficulty. Tacitus talks about the Romans crossing in flat-bottom boats. But as the transport with Ireland became more important, as communication became more important, obviously there was need for some more permanent way of crossing rather than the ferry. There were 6 points of crossing the straits between Beaumaris and Carnarvon. This here is the narrowest part in the straits, and here they sent across their pigs and cattle in their hundreds, as well as, of course, taking their carts and carriages in fairly flimsy vessels. One of the most exciting things, I suppose, one would see would be the crossing of the hundreds of cattle brought from Ireland to Anglesey and then being driven by the drovers to the centres of consumption, particularly in London, I suppose.
Fording the straits caused tremendous havoc.
Occasionally, because of the state of the tide, after all, you've only got about 20 minutes to half an hour of a stand of tide, a slack water here. Obviously, it took longer than that, therefore the cattle were carried downstream. And you could see the boatmen were with their ropes trying to lasso the cattle, and indeed, many times, both boatmen and cattle ended up in the water.
So what were the problems for bridge building?
The first hazard was here, the Swillies, because the tide runs about 8 knots at Springs, and it's a very difficult area because of the nature of the countryside. On both sides, there's high ground, and therefore vessels had to use their highest sails or taller sails, and the masts were high. And so you used your topgallant sails, your royals, all the high sails that you've got. Now this meant that the bridge had to be at least 100 feet above sea level, and this was a constraint put upon Telford in building the bridge.
It was a constraint Telford took in his stride. The man who built Pont Cysylltu was not afraid of heights. Work began on building the bridge in the spring of 1819. 200 men were employed to begin with, and those working on the foundations were fortified with ales and spirits. Steadily, the bridge grew higher and higher to meet the Admiralty's regulations. It took 7 years to complete and was in its time the greatest suspension bridge in the world.